kind of a Darwinian process. If more than one reader or editor that I respected said this needs to go, then as painful as it was to cut something out, listen to them. Some of the things I kept in, even if others didn't agree because I thought it was important, but I did try to make it so the book communicated the message I wanted it to. It was honest. Structure can help. If you're writing about your life, it sort of gives you something to frame the story around, but the important thing is to just start writing, because I think we can get too caught up on preparing and not enough on just doing, getting it down.
That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Kerry Kite. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post 9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists, and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills. Episode 82 features Rob Henderson, an Air Force veteran, the person who coined the term luxury beliefs, and the author of Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. He is a columnist for the Free Press, a founding faculty fellow at the University of Austin, and an instructor for Peterson Academy. Welcome. This is Veteran Made. Cool. Well, listen, let's jump right into it. We are recording. Rob Henderson, welcome back to Veteran Made.
Yeah. Hey, Kerry. Great to be here.
Thanks, man. Super stoked to have you back. It's fun to start doing repeat guests. Done one repeat guest. Nate Boyer came on again at the end of last year, and so really excited to have you back. Excited to have you back on video. We were joking before that we didn't have video last time because I was in a hotel room with shitty internet, but here we are. So for those who might not know who you are, if you could give us just a brief primer on who Rob Henderson is and what he's doing, where and when he served, and then I'll jump into some specific questions from there.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's see. I just finished up a PhD. Well, this was a little over a year ago. I received a PhD from the University of Cambridge, so that's why I'm currently living in England. I arrived here a few years ago to do the PhD, but now I'm just here on a visa. But I studied here psychology. Before this, I received a bachelor's degree in psychology from Yale, where I studied used the GI Bill, and then backing way up, I wrote this book. My book, it's a memoir called Troubled, and it sort of documents my experiences growing up in foster homes in Los Angeles, living just through a lot of disorder and chaos in my early life. Later enlisted in the military, and there were some setbacks and some hiccups along the way, but then eventually ended up going to college and making this career for myself. Getting a somewhat of a large following on Twitter, which is, I guess we're supposed to call it X now, and Substack, and writing a newsletter, building a platform, and building a pretty decent sized readership, where now my weekly newsletters are sent out to 50,000 subscribers. This book is set to be released soon. It's received blurbs and praise from people across the political spectrum, including Jordan Peterson and many others. But my military experience, it was important to me, and I dedicate a couple of chapters to it in the book because it was so critical in sort of redirecting my life trajectory. I enlisted right out of high school when I was 17. Went through basic trainings, was the Air Force, Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. Tech school at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, then back to Texas at Shepherd, first duty station at what was then called McChord Air Force Base in 2008, but it merged with Fort Lewis, so now it's Joint Base Lewis McChord. And after that, I was stationed at Ramstein in Germany. And in the interim, I did a couple of deployments, one in Qatar at Al Udeid, and then the other at Manas in Kyrgyzstan. And that's the kind of the short version. But I was in for 8 years. I did 2 4-year enlistments.
I love it. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm one of the 50,000 subscribers, and we'll obviously link out to it again in the show notes, as well as the opportunity to purchase the book. Highly encourage everybody to
to follow you on Twitter, and I'm going to call it Twitter till they tell me to till they remove it
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the.
yeah.
Follow you on Twitter and follow you on Substack. I've obviously been a fan for a long time, and discovered you through that Jordan Peterson, Barry Weiss, Steven Pinker kind of whole
Mm,
sphere of people. And I actually remember the first time I had you on. I remember reaching out. I was listening to uh, episode of the podcast you did with Jordan Peterson, and then you all kind of like skipped over the military stuff, which I actually found fascinating. I'm surprised that he didn't try to dig a little deeper. And then when you went on Barry's show, same thing. She kind of talked a little bit more about it with you, but then it was kind of skipped over. And so I saw my strategic in there to be like, hey man, I'm sure not a lot of people talk to you about the military. So
yeah.
I'm glad that we got one episode out of the way, and now we can dig into Troubled, which I've read and loved, and again we'll link it out for folks to buy. Would you mind if I read a short passage from it just to kind of get us going and kick us off?
Yeah.
Cool. So this is Rob writing. I've come to believe that upward social mobility shouldn't be our priority as a society. Rather, upward mobility should be the side effect of far more important things: family, stability, and emotional security for children. Even if upward mobility were the primary goal, a safe and secure family would help achieve it more than anything else. Conventional badges of success do not repair the effects of a volatile upbringing. Um, and that's very, very early in the book, and it sets it up really well. And there's multiple through lines of the book, but one of the ones that I want to focus a little bit here on in our conversation is your search for stability. And you kind of ended up finding some of that stability in the military. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to transition into the military from civilian life?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was, by the time I was 17, I'd lived in foster homes, I was adopted, but there were divorces and separations and all of this sort of family drama, family tragedies, so many things had happened by the time I reached my senior year of high school. Um, your instincts were right there that like so few people, like so few people even have any contact with the military. They may have a family member or something, but it's just a vanishingly small number of people have served or know anyone who's served. And you're probably familiar with a lot of the recent figures and the headlines about like recruitment shortfalls, and it's just fewer and fewer people, man, who are even aware of this segment of society. But for me, I was growing up in kind of a working class blue collar area of Northern California in the mid 2000s, shortly after, so this 2007. So, not far from 9/11, two wars going on. There was just a lot going on in the country. The military was like more salient in people's minds, more people were thinking about it. And so, I left home when I was 16. I moved in with my friend and his dad and his brother for my senior year. And my friend's dad, who we lived with, I mean, he was a private investigator. He wasn't home a lot, but he'd kind of sit us down sometimes and he talked to us and he would tell me, about his experiences. So he had been in the Air Force, I want to say in like the 70s or maybe the early 80s. And he said that he enjoyed the experience. And then one of my history teachers was also in the Air Force. And so it was just pure, complete coincidence that both of these sort of older male adult figures in my life when I was a teenager had been Air Force vets, and they were like, yeah, this could be a good option for you. My history teacher, he showed me a picture of himself in his uniform. He pulled it up on his computer, and I was like, oh, that looks kind of cool. And he told me, he could kind of tell that I was a, bright, curious kid, but I was just unfocused. I barely graduated high school. I graduated with a like 2.2 GPA, like a C minus average, essentially. Bottom third of my class, just was not really in a position to go to college, either sort of in terms of my maturity or my academic inclinations, or financially, just was not in a place to go to college. So between these two guys, encouraging me, it became a serious possibility in my mind. And, there was some family drama and there was other things going on to the point where there was really nowhere I could go after I graduated from high school, I realized. And so it was kind of a half impulsive, half semi thought through, it wasn't a very good plan, but it was like, I don't know if the military is the right decision right now, but I know that the path I'm on is the wrong one. I was a bag boy at a grocery store making minimum wage. I was just struggling to make ends meet, and so, I knew at the very least I wasn't going to be poor, or at least very poor, if I enlisted. And so, I signed up to take the ASVAB, and I remember when I signed up to take it, it was scheduled for 10:30 in the morning at this testing center, and so I knew I could skip school that day because I had a valid excuse. And so the night before, my friends and I just like drank Four Loko and played Xbox, and I just didn't even think to study. It just wasn't on my radar. I just was like, oh, I'm taking this test, we'll see how it goes, and ended up doing pretty well on it. And my recruiter was like, yeah, you should, you qualify for, all the jobs we have available. And so went off to MEPS. I did the DEP program. This was, yeah, I was still in high school, did MEPS, DEP program, the whole thing. And yeah, shipped out that summer. I was still 17. I had to have my adoptive mom sign one of the, like a permission slip. Was basically what it amounted to, was because I was underage. And I was the youngest guy in my basic training flight. And the oldest guy, I think he was 27, and I was, the youngest at age 17. And yeah, just that was probably the first, and maybe even to this day, the best decision I ever made, honestly, because it completely turned my life around and put me on a different trajectory. The town I grew up in, the kinds of friends I had around me, the people I had around me, um, just to give a sense of, what the typical outcome was like for people where I grew up. So I had 5 close friends growing up in high school. So it was a group of 6 of us. It was me raised in foster homes. 2 of my other friends were raised by single moms. One was raised by a single dad. Another was raised by his grandmother because his dad was in prison and his mom was addicted to drugs. And, that was like kind of, that story, those sort of kinds of backgrounds are becoming increasingly common in more sort of blue collar, lower income areas all across the country now. And it was like that in where I grew up in California. And so, um, where did my friends end up? I sort of dwell quite a bit on the lives of my friends in my book too, because I didn't want this story to be just about me and, oh, look at this guy who made a successful life for himself. And, I wanted to also tell the story of what is the more common outcome for people who grew up the way that I did. So 2 friends went to prison. I had one friend who was shot to death. My other friends kind of working menial jobs. They're doing okay. I had one friend who joined the military, and he's actually the one who's doing the best right now, was the guy who joined the military, which I think just sort of speaks to how it can help to change people's lives. But the rest of them, they're just not doing very well. And that could have easily been where I wound up if I had just stayed in that town and sort of made the same kinds of mistakes that I was already making at age 17. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of the snapshot of that point. And then, yeah, the excerpt you read about upward social mobility, I mean, I had a pretty fortunate trajectory. But, it wasn't until I started to really experience, a decent level of success that I realized, like, our whole idea about mobility and success it's flawed. I mean, it's, whatever, going to college and, serving in the military and, having a good career, like, it's better than not having those things, but it doesn't make up for, having extremely difficult early life. Even if every single kid who comes from chaos and disorder and early life difficulties, even if every single one of them, goes on to go to college and get a nice high paying white collar job, and, on paper, their resume looks good, but that doesn't necessarily heal the wounds or the scars from their early life of just extreme neglect, or, having a very tumultuous early life. And the thing is, like, you know, even if a kid doesn't go on to attain, astounding levels of success, I still think it's important to pay attention to the kinds of environments kids are raised in, to think more about the breakdown of the family in the US, of what the experiences of kids are like. If a kid is, having difficulties early in their life, maybe experiencing neglect, or their parents aren't, sort of giving them the amount of attention or adequate care, the kid isn't going to be thinking, oh, this is going to affect my future odds of going to college. It's going to affect it's going to increase my chances of being incarcerated later. Like the kid isn't thinking about it. The kid is just thinking like, I wish I had my dad around, or I wish my mom would pay more attention to me, or I wish I had, someone sort of checking in on me. And so we could be thinking about those things too, because what was on my mind when I was a kid growing up in the foster homes. And that was what was on my friends' minds when they were living in similarly unpromising circumstances. Um, and so, it's just something else we should be thinking about in addition to questions around mobility and economics and inequality. All of those things are important, of course, but we could also be thinking about, what's going on in kids and their home lives and their family lives. I mean, we're bifurcating in the country, I think, overall, where sort of middle, upper class families in the US, they're becoming like helicopter parents, where they're probably overindulging in many cases, not every case, but in many cases where they're sort of monitoring their kids a little too closely and not letting them have a little bit of freedom to make mistakes and, be a little bit reckless within certain bounds. And then on the other end of society, in the sort of more poor and working class areas of the country, it's like, whatever the opposite of helicopter parenting is, just like neglect, or kids raising themselves, or parents just like kind of checked out, or maybe strung out on opioids or drugs, or, having a string of different, boyfriends, or multiple divorces. I mean, that friend that I mentioned before that I lived with my senior year of high school, I lived with him and his dad had been married and divorced 5 times before my friend graduated from high school. Like that's kind of common. I mean, just sort of breakdown of the family, breakdown of marriage, and that's sort of what's happening on the other end of society. That the kind of educated public, the middle class and upper middle class, they're not really paying much attention to. So I use the book as a way to sort of highlight what's happening in these communities too.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I'm a dad. My daughter's, by the time this comes out, she's 4. And last summer we had, we my wife and I both come from divorce. My parents have been married and divorced multiple times to, multiple partners, and same on her side. And so it's something that we've talked about. I mean, we've known each other since we were 13. So we've actually talked a lot about it,
Hmm.
the majority of our lives, because we've known each other longer than we haven't. But obviously, as we were dating in earnest and engaged and then married, like we talked a lot about it and still talk a lot about it. And when our daughter was born, we're both working parents, right? And so it was COVID, and so she was at home with us all year for her first year of life. So she would be with me half the day, getting fed while I'm on Zooms and working and doing stuff, and then she'd be in the little playpen behind me as I worked in the basement. And my wife had the same setup at the kitchen table upstairs, so she would feed her and she would play in there, and we would just kind of rotate back and forth. And I mean, looking back, it was an incredible year. But as the world started to open back up, we had discussions about, all right, well, what are we going to do? What kind of daycare do we want? How early do we want her to go to preschool? Do we want Montessori? Do we want kind of all of these things? And us being educated people that we are and thoughtful people that we are, we're like, well, we want her to be educated, and we want her to stay ahead of the curve, and we want her to get into Montessori if we can. And so she was in a nice mom and pop one in New York where we lived there, and then we moved to Richmond, and we found a Montessori. We got her into the Montessori, and it ended up not being a great experience for her or for us, but we kept holding on to it because we were like, man, this is the right move. Like she needs to have this kind of structure and all the data that supports Montessori and the model and the independence, but the structure and all these different things, right? And I am not blanket criticizing the Montessori model, nor am I blanket criticizing this particular institution. But we ended up having this kind of come to Jesus moment where we were like, what do we want for our child? And do we want the right thing for our child? And we realized once we pulled her out, we made the decision to pull her out and put her back into more of a mom and pop style kind of preschool, daycare, community based thing. Dude, I mean, she just changed overnight, like back into the kid that she is. And was happy and laughing. And we saw some of the it's not like she lost out on the opportunity to grow as a thinker, as an operator, as a 3-4 year old. But we realized, like, holy shit, our kid needs what our kid needs, and our kid just needs us to be around and to be involved in her life, to love her, to laugh, to play. Obviously the Jordan Peterson sort of influence. Like, we teach her to negotiate, right? Like, we have conversations with her, and she'll want something, and like right now her thing is she wants to wear these princess dresses, and it's like, cool, that's where you can wear that at home and on the weekends, but you can't wear it to school. And if for no other reason, just to teach her to negotiate through life and figure out these things that she wants. And the last 6 months of us just being together and like being a family, and the three of us figuring out just how to be with each other, like, to me, especially as I was reading your book in prep for this, I'm like, man, that's what she needs. That's enough. Like, that's it, right? Like, the rest will come as it comes through a stable home that she grows up in. But this kind of just the three of us being together and really being there for each other is something that stood out in stark contrast for me as I was reading about your upbringing.
Yeah. I mean, it's important, I think, like, having those interactions, and not, I mean, I think a lot of parents, especially more sort of educated parents who, are understandably focused on their kids, positioning their kids to be successful later in life, it becomes this sort of, this kind of almost like this, I don't know, mathematical, like, okay, do X and this kid's going to turn out Y. So you need to get them in this school and this program and this thing. And really, I think it's, if a kid's going to be successful, if they're academically inclined, all those, like, those things will come later, and those sort of patterns and talents and inclinations will emerge. But especially the first few years of life, what the kid really needs, is just sort of care, nurturance, interaction with the parents, just sort of being close by and feeling cared for, and those kinds of things. And so, I mean, we could sort of focus more on what's going on with children rather than whatever the sort of priorities and concerns of adults are. I mean, I quote early on in the book, in the preface, the Yale sociologist and physician Nicholas Christakis, who's, he is one of the more sort of leading lights at Yale, which has increasingly become a sort of embarrassment of an institution, which, I could go on a whole rant about what happened to Yale and all these universities, but Nicholas Christakis is one of the good ones. And he has this line in one of his books where he says that, basically every single childcare innovation in the United States has prioritized the concerns of adults, and what is best for children has always been secondary at best, something along those lines, where anytime we think, what should we do about, childcare, what should we do about, child rearing and mobility and all these things, it's always sort of, what do adults think is best? What do we think about success? How do we sort of set our kids up to do the things that we want them to do? But there's not a lot of thought or attention paid to, what does the kid want? What's good for them? And like, what does the kid want? Not in the sense of like, give them ice cream or candy or something, but what does the kid want in terms of like, does the kid want to be closer to their parents? Do they want to be around their mother and their father? What is it that would be sort of ideal from their perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, do they want, like, well, my daughter's very rambunctious and high energy and very disagreeable, which I love, and it's gonna serve her well in life. But she wants to run, she wants to dance, she wants to get up and jump. So what do? We allow her to do those things, and we kind of help her figure out how best to do those things. The way she's going to be the best version of herself is if I'm the best version of myself, and my wife is the best version of herself, and then we're the best versions of us together. And that includes the imperfections that our daughter witnesses daily, right? She witnesses us having conversations where we disagree, or conversations where we make mistakes, or, she's on this kick right now. If we say the word hate, she's like, we don't say hate. And we're like, yeah, no, that's true. You don't say hate. We do say it sometimes when we're describing it correctly, but you don't know that. And she just like, she's so confused, but we just talk to her, and we talk to each other, and like, it's, she's just getting the best possible version that she can get in any given moment. And that was just, I don't know, a big shift for me within the last 6 months as a dad, and then really crystallized as I was reading the book, during that same time period in prep for this. And it was just, it was kind of, I don't know, it put me at ease, I guess, in a way. And I'm not sure what other feedback you've gotten from that section of the book, the early sections of the book, but I know that it was obviously painful for you to go through, and and painful to write, maybe, which I want to talk about next. But it did put me at ease, and I'd be curious if others have told you that. So in terms of the writing of the book, I've got a few questions on process and content and just kind of different things. So, I mean, when did the idea come for you to write the book? How difficult was it for you to get started, just from like hey, there's nothing on these pages and I'm going to fill it with words? And then how difficult was it for you to go through the content of your life and the memories and these things and really go through that process?
Yeah, it was hard, man. I mean, so the book was kind of about 5 years in the making. And yeah, I mean, I remember initially I was paralyzed when I signed the contract to write the book in early 2020, and it was just completely, as soon as I signed it and realized what I had gotten myself into, I became sort of frozen. Like, oh man, what did I just do? I have to write a book. Like, I've written articles, I've written essays, I've written newsletter posts, 800 words here, maybe 1,500 words there. But the idea of writing 80,000 words into a book, the project just seemed too daunting. And so for about 3 months passed, and I just hadn't written anything down and had a little bit of that writer's block. And then I spoke with other authors, other memoirists, other people, and um, I really wanted to communicate these experiences and to get people to understand what's happening to so many sort of sidelined and struggling kids across the country. And what's happening with families, what's happening with social mobility. Why is it that so many young kids aren't doing as well as we would like them to do? Questions around poverty and instability and all these things, like what are the actual factors that predict success in life? Um, and so, I talked to like I said, other writers, and, one person said something that, basically the question for a memoir isn't who am I, but who am I in this story?
Mm.
And for some reason that unlocked something in me, which was basically, initially I thought, okay, I'm going to write this book as this sort of retrospective account, sort of commenting on these stories from my past and giving my thoughts and reflections on them. And then I realized the most effective way to tell this story would actually be from the perspective of myself at that age. What do I remember? What were my experiences like? What did I see? What did I hear? What did I smell? Just every sort of sensory feeling that I had, to just like fully bring the reader along with me on this experience of what is it like to, live in a foster home when you're 7 years old, and, seeing your foster siblings come and go, or like the uncertainty of where you're going to live next. What is it like to see, after living in those experiences, to see your parents divorced, or what is it like to, be a teenager with a bunch of other, reckless boys, and, vandalizing buildings and getting into trouble and getting into fights, and, what that does to someone, and how early life experiences are directly connected to how we sort of think about ourselves later. And, they felt like the most effective way would be to actually go back in time and remember that. And so, yeah, it was difficult. I mean, to try to remember everything. I basically only told the stories which contained my most sort of vivid recollections and the most important stories. And, I was listening to the music from that era. Like as I was writing, I'd listen to like the music from the 90s. I would, I would eat the food, or at least buy the same snacks that I would eat as, I'd buy like the generic Pop Tarts from Walmart and open the package and smell it and see if like any memories would form, anything come to the surface. And it was surprisingly effective, just going, trying to do as much as I could to re-immerse myself into that period and those periods. So, I'd be sleeping and then suddenly I'd bolt awake at like 3 a.m. and say, oh, like I hadn't thought about that in years, and like rush to my computer and try to jot down everything that had come to mind of, some interaction I had with a friend, or something that, something that occurred between, I don't know, my family, or what have you. So just all of these different stories that I was trying to sort of rekindle, and talking to my friends, talking to my mom, my sister, my adoptive family. And ultimately, yeah, it ended up being pretty effective. And yeah, but it sucked, man. Like, of course, like the emotional part sucked too. I mean, there was a period where, so I started writing those early, like the first half of the book was basically during the lockdown. And I remember when I was writing it, I was taking naps in the middle of the day, which I usually don't take naps. I'm not a nap person. But I was writing those first chapters. In the afternoon, I would suddenly sleep for 20 or 30 minutes. And initially, I attributed it to, oh, it's, we're in the lockdown, there's a global pandemic, there's all this social unrest in the country, there's just so many things going on. And, I'm just, my body's just exhausted and I'm reacting to something like that. And then it wasn't until later that I connected the dots and was like, probably maybe those things contributed, but the main thing was probably just truly trying to relive the moments of my early life, the sort of most exhausting, distressing, upsetting memories. And yeah, to some extent, I was surprised at how sort of fresh the feelings were that were attached to those early experiences that I hadn't thought about in so long. Um, and then trying to chart the outline of the basically, having a sort of a narrative thread, a coherent thread throughout, because, a memoir it's not an autobiography. It's not meant to detail every single thing that you've ever lived through or experienced. No one wants to read about the time I went to the dentist or, whatever, like the boring, mundane activities. I only tell the stories that might be interesting to the reader. But it still all has to hang together into a coherent narrative such that people understand, cause and effect. This happened, then that happened, and why did that happen? And why am I telling you this? Like, why would I care about this? I didn't want to bore the reader, and so it was a lot of deciding what to leave in and what to, keep out.
Yeah, I mean, you did a great job. That's where both versions of Rob, or I guess all the versions of Rob, come into play, right? There's the Rob who's writing the memoir and understands, I'm gonna leave this anecdote in, I'm gonna remove this anecdote, or I'm gonna leave that anecdote out, or I'm gonna blend these anecdotes together because it is a memoir and not, factual autobiography in the sense of like, every single moment needs to be strung together perfectly. But then there's also the individual character of Rob within each of those chapters or anecdotes or kind of portions of the book. You did a great job of yes, inhabiting the version of you that went through those experiences and had all of those sensory experiences, but it also did very much feel like this Rob that I'm talking to right now is the one who wrote those stories. Were you thinking that intentionally about it, or was it like, hey, I'm just going to immerse and let that subconsciously happen?
It was more the latter. Yeah, it was really just, I wasn't trying to tell a story in a certain way. I just told the story in the way that felt natural, in the way that felt honest. Initially it was like, I wrote the vomit draft, like the kind of initial draft of just brain dump everything that I could possibly remember or think of. And yeah, that first, the first rough draft of the manuscript was kind of over bloated and contained a lot of sort of things that were maybe interesting to me, but wouldn't really be interesting to the reader. It was just, some of it was my own ego of just like, well, I think this is a clever little paragraph. And it's like, it adds nothing to the story and no one else is going to care. And so, there was a lot of sort of back and forth with my editors and feedback from other writers to like really make it, it was kind of a Darwinian process of like, if more than one reader or editor that I respected said this needs to go, then as painful as it was to cut something out, I listened to them. Some of the things I kept in, even if others didn't agree because I thought it was important. But by and large, I did try to make it so that the book it communicated the message I wanted to. It was honest. Every single thing that happened in the book, really did happen. And it was, you know, the other thing was, I guess what you just said about like, okay, who's telling the story? Is it, myself when I was a kid or when I was a teenager or when I was in my early 20s? Is it me now? And, I did try to write it from the perspective of myself at that age as best I could. And I tried to sort of re-enter the perspective that I had at those ages and what I was thinking about, what my priorities were. And yeah, I was just, I guess the one thing that surprised me was just how much sort of, especially the teenage years and early 20 years, was just the rage. I used to be such an angry person. Like I had actually, to some extent, I was taken aback by it, which was like, I guess I kind of had the sense like I'm a calmer person. Like I just knew that already. Like I'm just a calmer, more kind of even keeled person now. at age 34 than I was when I was 24, especially when I was 18. But, sort of remembering who was around me, the events, what I was feeling was just this sort of throbbing, simmering, relentless anger. And it would just come out at like very inconvenient times. And I mean, I think there are like, I don't know, 7 or 8 fights in the book, but there were probably 7 or 8 others that I could have added that I just didn't, because it wouldn't add anything to the story. It was just like I got into a lot of dumb altercations because I had an ego, or because I had a chip on my shoulder, or because I had this fear, especially as a teenager, that people would think I was weak. They would think like, oh, this kid, he's, and I don't know where, like, it was all in my own head, like, oh, I didn't have a family, no one cared about me, and I have to prove to the world that I'm worth something. So anytime anyone challenges me or crosses my path, I'm gonna have to show them that I'm actually not weak. I am strong. And it would come out in, that sort of dumb teenage male violent way. And then, yeah, so then when I was shaping the book, it was like, this process of, being honest with those parts of myself. And there's also this question of like, George Orwell has this famous quote about how um, any man who gives a good account of himself is probably lying, since any life, when viewed from the inside, is seen as a series of defeats. And basically, he's like, you have to be very skeptical whenever someone tells you about their life, because we naturally have this bias in our favor. We always want to view ourselves as like the good person, the hero of the story, the person who is in the right. And I tried to be honest in that, like, tell the stories, tell the moments and the memories where I didn't always come out looking so good.
Yeah, I mean, you did a really good job at that, where it's clear you're the protagonist, but and you also, I mean, there's multiple moments where you just kind of let the reader experience the poor decisions that you made, or the poor circumstances that you were in, or kind of whatever it was, and you don't. Sometimes you speak about it and kind of comment from now, but then other times you just let it happen and kind of keep it moving into the next section or next paragraph, or even like next chapter, which I particularly enjoyed, because it's a really hard thing to do, to tell your own story and be as truthful as you can. You can't be objective about it, obviously. But you can be, the best version of subjective as you can be. Which obviously, I don't know you that well, but having followed and listened, it seemed like you kind of like captured. It's not like there were things that I was surprised at in the book, but there weren't things I'm like, wow, that doesn't seem like Rob. You know what I mean? Like, it was kind of like there was enough surprise, but then there was also just the like, oh yeah, that makes sense that he would be working through that at that time, kind of in that way. Did you start with any? I've kind of two uh, granular process questions, and I want to come back to the emotional one, at the kind of your surprise at anger. So first question, did you start with any sort of outline or journal entries or anything like that, or did you just start the vomit draft and just go?
So I had like a very rough chapter outline.
Okay.
As far as like, okay, so there's this, born into poverty in LA, and then there's the foster homes and this, that. And so I had like but it ended up changing and evolving and shifting over time. But I had like a very rough, I think initially I had 10 chapters in mind, and it ended up being 12. And I kind of made some chapters shorter, and I added another chapter. So it kind of evolved and moved around. But ultimately, like, the basic structure was there. But
Did
then,
you find this? Oh, sorry.
yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, no, then it became, yeah, then it was like, okay, I guess it wasn't like the vomit draft of like the whole book I'm going to vomit. It was more chapters where like, okay, here's the chapter that I want to focus on. I'm going to write, vomit draft, go cover this period, and I had like rough targets in mind for how long I wanted it to be. And, I just told the story until it seemed like it exhausted itself, and then moved on to the next phase and the next phase. And then, yeah, started to get feedback and reviewing each chapter and making sure that it was all, it all cohered and it all made sense. And, but yeah, it was, loose structure, but it was more like, I think structure is overrated, at least for this kind of project. Maybe for others, but it's funny. I've talked to fiction writers too. I mean, it didn't really work in this case, but I've heard fiction writers who will say things like, I'll be writing and then I'll come up with something interesting and then I have to go back and change this because it's foreshadowing this other thing and that, so, but I think for memoir, structure can help. If you're writing about your life, it sort of gives you something to frame the story around. But really the important thing I think is to just start writing, because I think we can get too caught up on preparing and not enough on just doing, on just getting it down. And the writing was the hard part, honestly. I mean, the writing was that, you can spend all day sort of planning things out, but what really matters is actually executing.
Yeah. Did you jump around at all, or did you do it all in order?
Mostly in order. Vomit draft was in order. I
Yeah.
vomit draft chapter one and chapter two and so on and so on. But then as far as editing, I would, I'd edit on, I'd spend a little time on chapter three or then jump ahead to chapter five. But then, and so, yeah, I mean, there were parts of the book where I did think it was important actually to foreshadow certain things later. Because, otherwise it wouldn't make sense if something just suddenly came out of nowhere. Even though, like, for me it did. I mean, that's the weird thing, is like, there were parts of, like, in the middle of the book, our home is foreclosed. um my mom's partner Shelly she gets shot, and there's all of this drama that comes, but they receive this insurance windfall, and we buy houses, and then the house is foreclosed, and it came out of nowhere. Even, I mean, I remember my editor was like, what the hell, like, this is, and she was kind of like, you need to give the reader some heads up. And I was like, when I was 16, I didn't get a heads up. Like, no one told me this was going to happen. That's just life. Shit happens. Um, but then I started to think, and, it's just, okay, so was there anything in Shelley's character or her habits or something that may give the reader some inkling that, like, she would be the kind of person to make some kind of risky real estate investments? And I thought back, we'd play board games, we would play Monopoly, and she was always the one to, like, basically hold properties and not cash. And she did enjoy going to casinos and gambling money, and she was a bit more reckless and risky in terms of how she handled finances compared with my mom. And so, I did put those stories in later, realizing, like, that may help the reader to contextualize and understand, even if I, as a teenager, didn't really connect those dots. um, I did later sort of understand this, and so I put those in just to sort of help the reader to understand. um, which is like, maybe that's just a more fair way to do things, because otherwise, yeah, it just seems like weird things happening in the book without any through line or any understanding. And so, in a weird way, for memoir, you do have to some extent, use the tools of storytelling and fiction just to ensure that the reader can follow and track things and to feel like the story makes sense.
Totally. I'm working on a personal essay memoir style project right now, and I was chuckling to myself as you were like, "The writing's the hard part," as an old Hemingway quote, right? Like, writing's easy.
Mm.
All you gotta do is sit at a typewriter and bleed. But like, I've got a full outline. Like, I know, but it's like to actually go in and write each chapter. And there's obviously some that are more traumatic than others in terms of like emotionally going there, relationally going there, whatever, what have you. And then there's others that are just like, man, that's going to be a fucking slog to just write that chapter, because it's dense, or it's whatever, but it's got to get written, and it's just hard to actually do. And back to the naps that you were taking, like, I'm sure obviously a lot of it was emotional because you were processing things, but it's also physical too. Like, writing takes work, and you're working, your brain and your body is outputting all of this, not just your mind, not just your heart and soul and all that stuff. It's like the whole thing. So the exhaustion makes sense. I want to be respectful of your time, because I know it's late there, and how much more time do you have?
I mean, we can go for another 15 or 20.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So a couple more technical questions about the writing, and then I want to ask some other military things. So, how did you determine big literary and kind of memoir poetry community corner that I'm a part of here in the veteran space? So these questions and answers are valuable. How did you decide when you were going to be stubborn and say, I'm going to keep that thing? And then when did you kind of use that Darwinian approach to allow the Darwinian process to work? And when did you decide, nope, I'm gonna keep this one?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so as far as like when to know when to let something go, I did use this. Basically the rule of thumb I used was, like, because we all have our idiosyncrasies, we kind of, people can kind of agree on, like, people are very good at spotting bad writing, but there is a lot of disagreement as far as what good writing looks like. Um, And so if something sucks, it's usually universally panned. But if something is good, you will get mixed opinions sometimes. And so if one person I respected said, "Hey, I'm not sure this makes sense here," but then another person said, "Oh, I really, I did get this." There were some stories where literally a Pulitzer Prize winning author would say that was my favorite story, but then another highly accomplished author would say, "This doesn't make sense here. I don't get why this is here." And so, like, what are you supposed to do when you literally get conflicting advice and in those cases, I ended up just keeping it almost every time, or I think every time. But if two people said, "Hey, this doesn't make sense here," or "I don't know why you kept this here," or they flagged something, then I would let it go, because it's like two people caught something that if it didn't make sense to two people, then it's probably not going to make sense to most people. Um, then for what to let go, or no, rather what to retain when you're getting conflicting advice. I mean, some of it was just because I knew, like what the whole story looked like, and I knew what the end was, and I knew that certain vignettes or stories, you know, within a chapter, uh, held the story together long enough so that if hopefully the reader will remember it, so that by the time they get to the end, it'll all make sense. Um, so part of it was just kind of the foreshadowing elements of maybe the person reading it, they've only read this chapter, they haven't read the full manuscript, and so they don't understand. And so in those cases, I trusted my instincts. In other cases, it was just, yeah, some of it is hard to just explicitly verbalize, where like I just had this instinctive, intuitive feeling that this is an important part of the story. And if, I guess if it made me look good and someone said this doesn't make sense, often I would let it go because I knew that was my ego. But if it made me look bad, often I would keep it in because it just felt more honest.
Mm.
Because I was very concerned with that, about like people are going to think that I'm trying to write this fluff book about myself and how great I am. And what's funny, Carrie, is like there were there were like several stories where I did like good things and I didn't put them in the book because people are gonna like doubt it or think that I'm there was a story where I saved a girl from drowning and I didn't put it in the book because it just felt like too much patting myself on the back. I told the story where I drowned in one of the foster homes, nearly
That was
drowned.
what
Yeah, yeah,
my jaw was on the floor.
yeah. And I tell that story, and then a couple of years later, I was at my little sister's friend had a birthday party at her house, and one of the other little girl and I was there, and we're all around the birthday cake, and one of the other little girls, we didn't, we eventually noticed she was missing, like, oh, where did this girl go? And they had a big backyard, and they had this indoor swimming pool. And I looked in the distance and I could hear like some splashing, and I was like, oh, that's, she's drowning. Like I knew what drowning looked like because I had drowned. Like I knew what that was. And I immediately ran over there and grabbed her and pulled her out. And I was like, initially I wrote this and I'm like, it happened and it's nice. And, I can connect it to this other story about like, I knew she was drowning because I had drowned. So there is like it's part of the story, but it doesn't really add anything other than, hey, Rob did something nice. And so I ended up just throwing it out. Maybe I'll end up posting, like a series of these, what was left on the cutting room floor on my Substack or something.
Yeah.
But, for what to keep, a lot of it was just sort of gut level, instinctive, intuitive, and whether it contributed to the overall story at the, as a whole. And, did it make me look bad? Did it make me look good? And all of those factors sort of played a role in what to keep and what to leave out.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that and being vulnerable there, because I think that's a great answer and a helpful answer, and it's one that I think maybe some people that are working on a project, whether it's memoir or fiction or nonfiction or whatever, might not like it. But at the end of the day, if you're going to put yourself out there and try to accomplish a deliverable like this, whether it's artistic or entrepreneurial or even just academic, like you're going to have to make some of those gut level decisions yourself, and you have to trust that the right version of you is doing this project right now, and you have to have that kind of confidence to move forward. And I think the guardrails that you've provided for yourself will be helpful templates for people to think about as they navigate their own projects. Um, okay, so there's one interesting kind of military or portion, a couple of quotes from the military section that I'd like to wrap up chatting just a little bit about. So I'm going to pull a couple of quotes here. Bear with me, both you and the listener. You said here that I learned that this is from the book. I learned that so much of success depends not on what people do, but what they don't do. It's about avoiding rash and reckless actions that will land us in trouble. The military presses the fast forward button on the worst, most aggressive, and impulsive years of a young man's life, the time when a guy is most likely to do something catastrophically stupid. Then, towards the end, not the very end, but towards the end of the military section, when you were stationed in Germany, you said, I realized that my 22-year-old self was living a life that my 17-year-old self had chosen.
Hmm.
And kind of those two, it's definitely a truism. Like as I wrote that, I read, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so true. Like the law of attrition is just a very helpful way to make decisions, right? Like being a little bit more small c conservative with the decisions that you're not making will help you make
Hmm.
better decisions in the future. And then this notion, this very kind of meta thing of 22-year-old Rob was living a life that 17-year-old Rob chose. And I don't know how old you are now, but that version of Rob is writing about that. It's kind of like this. Can you talk about like what it was like for you to have that sort of self-awareness of those things and how you've taken that post-military into your grad work, into your papers, and I'd love to kind of just wrap up your teaching
Yeah.
and how you're working with Peterson Academy and putting your work out there publicly for people to consume.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that was an important lesson for me because, it's a lot of attention is paid to, here are the things that you need to do to be successful, but no one ever says, like, here are the things you shouldn't do to, like, avoid drastic failure. And, a lot of those things are very basic. Like don't drink and drive or don't, you know, seek physical altercations with strangers in public. Don't do hard drugs. Don't do there are a lot of things like that. Um, be careful who you enter relationships with. Maybe don't instead of sleeping with that person, maybe don't sleep with that person. So many things like that where you could just sort of avoid blowing your life up. And yeah, the military, I mean, it was so suffocating, the first couple of, well, really like the first year mostly, but it was like, basic training and tech school and then living in the dorms on base. And, it was just like, relative to the extremely high levels of freedom I had before, it was like, I felt like I couldn't do anything at all. And it was mind numbing and I hated it at the time. But then, in hindsight, it was the right call for like, 17, 18, 19 years old to just like not be able to do all of the things that I wanted to do at all hours of the day. And I mean, even something like drinking, this is something that I kind of have changed my mind about. There was that thing about, in the military, I remember like, oh, you can enlist when you're 18, but you can't drink until you're 21. And I'm like, that's not the worst, honestly, like to, if you give an 18-year-old access to alcohol, especially, they're away from, I mean, you see it on college campuses, right? Like you see kids with, getting intoxicated and making decisions that they regret later, whether it's, sex or whether it's, like neglecting their homework or their studies or their personal lives or their relationships. Like it's, alcohol is actually, it's fun and it's exciting, but it can take over your life. I mean, I learned that lesson. And then later, yeah, by the time I was 22, into my second enlistment in Germany, and had done a couple of deployments, and I was just thinking, it was like I joined the military not because it was the right decision, but because I was, I knew it was better than the one that it was better than the alternative, right? Like it was better than remaining in Red Bluff and staying on that path, but um trying to, at that point, it was less about like trying to get away from my past and actually starting to think more about like building and constructing a good future for myself. Whereas up until that point, I mean, really from, childhood through age 22, I was living like day to day or week to week, paycheck to paycheck, moment to moment of just what's the next exciting thing? What's the next sort of short term goal that I had, or and then yeah, I think who knows what that specific age, a lot changes, right? You're sort of past the what I write about the young male syndrome in the book. You sort of get past those years. You get into your frontal lobes develop. You have a little bit more maturity and breadth of perspective at 20. Most guys at 22 versus when they're 18. Um, And so, yeah, I started to actually be a bit more introspective and reflective and actually sort of realize like, oh, what do I want for my life? What do I want for my future? And, is this what I always want to do? And then I started, I did this when I was 17 too. I mean, it's funny. I guess I've always kind of done this to some extent. I do it even now, which I can get into in a second. But what I'm describing here is when I was 17, I remember one reason I joined the military was because I worked at a restaurant as a dishwasher and a busboy. And then later, I got a job as a bag boy at a grocery store. And one reason I knew I didn't want to stay in Red Bluff and I wanted to get out and somehow was I looked at my older coworkers and I thought, is that who I want to be later in life? I'd see my coworkers, these guys in their mid late 20s, working in the same job, making a minimum wage or not much more than that, and it was weird. Like at the time, at first we kind of thought they were cool. Like they'd buy beer for me and my friends, or hook us up with weed, or they were like. But then I did later. By the time I got to my senior year of high school, I was like, it is weird that like some like 27-year-old guy like is buying us beer and like asking us to hang out at like high school parties. Like I don't want to be that guy. There's something weird about that. I don't. That's not what I see myself doing in 10 years. And then in the military, I had that same kind of pattern of thought of, I'd look at the older NCOs or senior NCOs or, retirees. And I think like, is this what I want to do for 20 years? Do I want to retire in this career? And when I realized the answer was no, then I really started to think seriously about what to do next. And then, yeah, now, when I was in grad school doing my PhD, I was like, do I really want to be a professor considering everything that's happening in higher ed right now? Not really. And then started to build this alternate sort of career path for myself. And so I think this is kind of a useful heuristic that people can have this sort of in their mental toolkit is just if you're on a path and you're uncertain about whether you want to remain on it, look at the people who are on the same path as you, but 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and think, okay, is that where I want to be in 5 years or 10 years and so on? And if the answer is no, then, now is the best time to start reconsidering and, figuring out what other trajectories and other options and opportunities you might have.
Yeah, and you got exactly where I was hoping you would go. And the only thing I would add for the listener is that does not mean that the decisions you made and the experiences that you had were the wrong ones over time. It just means
Right.
that it's not the same path that you're going to stay on. So many military veterans will transition out or won't transition out because they're like, man, I'm here. I did 8 years. I did 10. I got to stay because here's all the reasons why that's a bad idea. Instead of saying, well, actually, 8 years is a really great foundation for me to move on to the next thing. And then, oh, I've got my PhD and I'm not going to use it in the sense of like, being a professor at this or another institution. But that does not mean that obviously you learned things getting a PhD, but you also developed experiences and got reps at things that will propel you into the next thing. So it's this weird give and take between like attrition and, subtraction and addition. And again, negotiating your way through the world and navigating your experiences, not in this binary sense of like always right and always wrong, but like, oh, how do I kind of teeter totter between these things and figure out like what's the center of gravity here instead of like the absolute kind of thing that I have to be doing. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Right. It does. Yeah. About like not falling prey to the sunk cost fallacy, right? Of like, I mean, I had this, if you spent X number of years in the military and like, oh, every year that I'm in, I'm closer to retirement. So you might as well just keep going. And it's like, well, are you happy? Like, what are you going to do when you retire? Are you going to be able to like, is that going to be a better time to find an alternate career than the position you're in now? And I read about this in the book about how, when I first started thinking about using the GI Bill and going to college and doing something else, I had this conversation with my first supervisor and he basically said like, no, I'm not going to, of course I'm going to stay in. He's like, if you get out now and you go to college, I'd be, so much older than my peers. And, it's like, it's a waste of time essentially, right? Like you're basically starting so much further ahead in your life that it's like, you're basically, at a huge disadvantage. And I was like, is that really true though? Because the time is going to pass anyway, right? Like if you're unhappy, like why would you stay in something and just keep going with it just because you've spent X number of years in already? And, so I guess to some extent, yeah, it's the same thing, right? I have this conversation with postdocs and PhD students about like, oh, I spent 5 years or whatever getting a PhD and like I worked my whole life and like I've always wanted to be a professor and, I guess I'm just going to go for it even if I'm not happy anymore, even if this isn't giving me the kind of meaning and fulfillment I expected. It's just, you've always been on this track and you just sort of stay with the status quo. And no, I just think, yeah, the way you put it was correct. To just start thinking, you don't always have to stay on the track you're on just because you've invested so much time in it. If you think that you may be happy doing something else, you should go for it. In most cases, I think you should go for it.
Yeah, I agree. And that piece of trusting the experiences that you had, I think is one that our community particularly struggles with because we think it makes us, whether if you're a special operator, right? Like a lot of those guys will come out and they're like, well, that's who I am. That's what I did. So I can only be a trigger puller on the outside. It's like, oh man, that sets you up for something else. What are you interested in? What do you love? What do you want to do? Where do you want to take it? Flight line guys like you and me, it's a little bit like I was not mechanically or electrically inclined at all. But I look back on those 4 years as a weapons troop on F-15s being like, best job I ever had. Like, I love it. It's like, it's great. Like, what a great foundation, because it really stretched me in ways that I otherwise wouldn't have been stretched if I would have gone to study, writing and filmmaking and all those things without that kind of blip of an interruption. Okay. So before I get to the open-ended question that I asked to end each episode, what are you working on right now? Well, obviously we'll link out in the show notes to your Substack and to Amazon or wherever you want us to order the book from. Highly encourage everybody to do that. But where do you want to drive traffic? What are you working on right now? Anything you want to share about the immediate future?
Yeah, I mean, so, I'm still writing multiple times a week on my Substack newsletter. I have some lectures. So Peterson Academy, I filmed some lectures for them earlier last year, and I think they're going to launch, I want to say February.
Cool.
But yeah, I mean, it's, I don't think it's been fully confirmed, but I did see them sort of posting somewhere about this. So that'll launch, sometime early this year. Peterson Academy, my lectures, I did a course called The Psychology of Social Status. I did a series of 6 90-minute lectures. And so you'll be able to access those. It was, it was filmed. It was very professionally done. There was an in-studio audience. So I did Q&A with the students, and the whole thing was filmed. And I think it turned out beautifully. So that'll be out soon. And yeah, my book will be out. And yeah, otherwise, yeah, I mean, I'm just writing has been my main thing. It's, something that I've been enjoying a lot, is just communicating ideas on Substack and on Twitter. So yeah, any of those, anywhere you want to find me, those are the places to go.
Yes. Well, not only will we link it out, but you will be bombarded with multiple notifications from me across all of those platforms multiple times a day, the week that this episode goes live, as we put content out to share. So yep, we'll link all that stuff out. Okay. So to end each episode, I ask an open-ended question. What's on your heart and what's on your mind for our community right now? Could be a piece of advice, something you want to get off your chest, something you want to reiterate from what we've already talked about today. But Rob, what's on your heart? What's on your mind?
Yeah, this is what's on my heart, what's in my mind. I mean, yeah, I would say that, I mean, it's something we've sort of touched on already, which is basically be wary of getting stuck in any kind of rut, whether it's, sort of in your career, whether it's in your relationships, any of those things, right? Like, make sure that your priorities are right and you're doing the thing that actually satisfies you and fulfills you. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of this with, guys who are staying, who are re-enlisting, not because it makes them happy or because they feel like it's giving them meaning, or even, I get like the guys who are doing it for, if they have a family, financial reasons, that I totally get. But just the guys who are doing it out of some sense of like, yeah, like we've been talking about, there are options and opportunities. I write this in the book somewhere about how, the Air Force, the military, it asks a lot from you, but you can get a lot back in return. I mean, it gives you all of these benefits. Do your best to capitalize on those, and you can get far. I mean, the military experience is extremely valuable, I think. It's something that I continue to draw upon and think about, and I'm grateful for. So yeah, I guess just use those experiences and use the resources they give you, and don't overlook it. I mean, I think a lot of guys just take it for granted that you have the GI Bill, you have these things, and you don't really fully dwell on all of the options that you have before you. Like someone like me, I mean, I talk about this in the book too, about how going to a college like Yale was, basically, you know, might as well have been impossible. Might as well have been trying to go to the moon for all I knew. But the GI Bill was there. There were people around. There were other vets, even if they weren't on the education center. Don't limit yourself either, I guess would be the other thing. Is like a lot of vets think, oh, I want to go to college. We'll just go to the education center and whatever information they give you, and that's just might as well be the word of God. And that's not the case. There are a lot of vets online, a lot of people who want to help. There are a lot of programs and organizations and so many things. So, do your research, do your homework, and don't just sort of stick to the narrow confines of the base or the education center or the sort of environment immediately around you. There's a huge support system out there for vets who want to do great things in their lives.
Yeah. Generate the most and best options you can and make your own decisions.
Yeah.
Well said. Rob Henderson, sincerely appreciate your time. Good to see you again. Hopefully it's not the last time we do this. Appreciate you sharing your time and your words with us.
Thank you, Carrie. Appreciate it.
We'll see you, man.
Take care.